The air on the construction site was thick enough to chew, a gritty cocktail of fine dust from pulverized plaster, the sharp tang of freshly cut lumber, and the faint metallic scent of diesel fumes. A relentless chorus of noise battered the eardrums, the high-pitched whine of circular saws biting through wood, the percussive thud of hammers against nails, the guttural roar of an excavator clawing at the earth, and, punctuated through it all, the shouts of men communicating over the din. It was the daily grind at the old Henderson farmstead, a dilapidated relic slowly, violently surrendering to the march of progress. Big Tony, the foreman, stood like a bull amidst the orchestrated chaos, his face a mask of focused intensity under a layer of grime and sweat. A battered hard hat sat low on his brow, shading eyes that missed nothing. He barked orders, his voice a gravelly boom that somehow cut through the cacophony. "Marco, get that debris cleared by the old well. Sully, I need those measurements for the foundation, now. Chuck, you call that concrete supplier yet? We're on a schedule, people, a schedule." The crew, a motley collection of seasoned hands and younger workers, moved with a practiced, if sometimes weary, efficiency. They were tearing down a rotted, wraparound porch, its faded paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Further back, the excavator was digging a trench for the new foundation that would support a modern extension. Dust plumed with every swing of a sledgehammer, every bucketful of earth displaced. It was all about progress, efficiency, the relentless push to transform the old into the new, to meet deadlines and stay within budget. There was little room for sentimentality in the gritty, pragmatic world of demolition and construction. Marco, one of the younger members of the crew, grunted as he heaved a splintered porch plank onto the growing pile of debris. His task for the morning was to clear the area around an old, disused well that sat stubbornly in the path of the planned new patio. The well was a relic of a much earlier time, its stone walls moss-covered and crumbling in places, a rotted, partially collapsed wooden cover lying askew across its opening like a broken shield. It was an anachronism, a forgotten piece of the farm's history, now just another obstacle to be dealt with. As he paused to wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead with a dusty forearm, he thought he heard something. It was faint, almost subliminal, a delicate scratching sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or perhaps tiny claws. He glanced towards the well, then shook his head. Probably just rats, he figured, or the ancient structure of the farmhouse groaning under the assault of demolition. The air was so full of noise it was hard to be sure of anything subtle. He bent back to his work, tossing another piece of rotted wood onto the pile. The well itself seemed to emanate a faint, cool air, a whisper from the earth's depths. It was half choked with fallen leaves and decades of accumulated detritus, its dark opening a mysterious eye staring up from the ground. Marco gave it a cursory glance. Soon it would be filled in, concreted over, erased from the landscape like the rest of the farm's fading past. A brief, unexpected lull descended upon the site as the excavator operator shut down his engine for a moment and the saws fell silent. In that sudden pocket of relative quiet, the sound came again, more distinct this time. A definite, persistent scratching, followed by a soft, almost inaudible scrabbling. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like rats. There was a different quality to it, something a little more desperate, a little less furtive. Marco straightened up, his curiosity now genuinely piqued. He set down his crowbar and walked cautiously towards the edge of the old well. He peered down into the shadowy depths, but the sunlight barely penetrated the first few feet, leaving the bottom shrouded in darkness. He could still hear the faint scratching, seemingly coming from deep within. "Hey, Sully," he called over to one of the older, more seasoned workers who was taking a water break nearby. "You hear that? Sounds like something's down the well." Sully, a wiry man with a perpetually skeptical expression, ambled over, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He leaned over the well beside Marco, listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just the damn house settling, kid. Or maybe you're hearing ghosts of farmers past," he said with a grin, clearly unimpressed. "This place is old enough for 'em." He gave Marco a playful nudge. Don't let your imagination run away with ya. We got work to do. But Marco wasn't so easily dissuaded. The sound, though faint, had a certain insistence that gnawed at him. It didn't feel like an inanimate object or the usual scuttling of vermin. It felt different. He had to know what was making that persistent, almost pleading scratch. Undeterred by Sully's skepticism, Marco rummaged through the communal toolbox until he found a heavy-duty flashlight, the kind that could cut through serious gloom. He clicked it on, testing its bright, focused beam against the dusty wall of the farmhouse, then turned back to the well. "Give me a hand here, Sully, just in case I lean too far," he said, a note of seriousness in his voice that made the older worker pause. Sully grumbled good-naturedly, but positioned himself to steady Marco if needed. Marco leaned carefully over the crumbling stone lip of the well, aiming the powerful beam straight down the shaft. The light sliced through the murky darkness, pushing past the accumulated cobwebs and shadows, finally illuminating the very bottom, some 20 feet below. And there it was. Not rats, not a ghost. Staring back up into the sudden blinding glare of the flashlight with wide, luminous eyes. Its russet fur was matted with dust and grime, its bushy tail curled tightly around its thin body. It was clearly exhausted, its sides heaving and utterly terrified. As the light hit it, it flinched, pressing itself against the cold, unyielding stone wall, its small paws scrabbling uselessly at the smooth, unscalable surface. It let out a soft, high-pitched whine, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress. Marco gasped, pulling back slightly. Sully, peering over his shoulder, let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, his earlier skepticism vanishing in an instant. This wasn't what either of them had expected to find lurking in the forgotten depths of an old farm well. The sight of the trapped, frightened animal, so out of its element and so clearly helpless, sent a jolt of surprise and an immediate, unspoken pang of pity through both men. The workday, with its dust and noise and demolition, had just taken a very unexpected turn. The hushed exclamations and sudden stillness around the well quickly drew the attention of Big Tony. He'd been over by the excavator, bellowing instructions, and the abrupt halt in Marco and Sully's work, coupled with their craned necks over the old well, was an immediate red flag. "What's the holdup here, boys?" Tony boomed, his heavy work boots crunching on the debris as he strode towards them, his face a mask of impatience. "We ain't got all day to be playing peekaboo with a hole in the ground." Marco straightened up, a troubled look on his young face. "Boss, there's an animal down there, a fox. It's trapped." Sully nodded in agreement, pointing down into the well shaft. Tony's expression shifted from annoyance to a kind of weary disbelief. He pushed past them and peered down, his large frame momentarily blocking the sunlight. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for structural flaws and measuring progress, took in the sight of the small, dusty fox cowering at the bottom. For a moment, his face was unreadable. Then it hardened, his jaw setting in a familiar no-nonsense line. "A fox?" he grunted, straightening up. "So, just a pest. Probably fell in chasing a rabbit or something stupid. We gotta fill this thing in anyway by the end of the week. It's on the plans." He waved a dismissive hand. "Look, it's a wild animal. Nature takes its course. Let's get back to work, people. Time is money, and that thing down there ain't paying the bills." His words were blunt, pragmatic, echoing the tough, unsentimental persona he projected daily. Some of the other crew members who had gathered around murmured in what sounded like agreement, eager to avoid any further delays. Others shuffled their feet, looking a little uneasy but unwilling to challenge their foreman. Marco, however, looked visibly dismayed, his gaze dropping to the ground. The unspoken message was clear. The fox's fate was sealed, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of the renovation project. Big Tony turned on his heel, ready to march back to overseeing the foundation work, his mind already shifting back to concrete pours and load-bearing walls. The matter of the fox, as far as he was concerned, was closed. He'd made his decision, the schedule was paramount. Just as he took his first step away, a sound pierced the relative quiet that had fallen over the group. It wasn't a growl or a snarl, but a particularly mournful, almost childlike cry from the depths of the well. It was a thin, high-pitched sound, full of desolation and fear, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the heart. It was the unmistakable sound of a young creature in profound distress, perhaps sensing its abandonment, its bleak fate. Tony stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't turn around immediately, his broad back still to the well and his crew. But his shoulders, which had been set in a determined forward-moving line, seemed to droop almost imperceptibly. He remained frozen for a long, charged moment. The usual construction site symphony, the distant whine of a saw, the clatter of tools, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only that haunting, plaintive cry echoing from the darkness below. He glanced back, a quick, almost furtive look over his shoulder towards the well. His gaze then swept over the faces of his crew. He saw Sully's troubled frown, the uneasy shifting of the other men, and most pointedly, Marco's openly dismayed expression, his young face a mask of unspoken plea. They were all looking at him, waiting. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Tony's rugged features. Was it a memory of a childhood pet? A long-buried instinct of protectiveness? Or simply the undeniable raw sound of suffering that even his tough, pragmatic shell couldn't entirely deflect? The tight lines around his mouth softened ever so slightly. The immutable schedule, the pressing deadlines, the cost of lost time, all those things that usually dictated his every move suddenly seemed to waver, to lose some of their ironclad importance in the face of that one small, desperate voice from the well. Big Tony let out a long, gusty sigh, the sound like air escaping a punctured tire. He ran a calloused hand over his face, smearing the dust and sweat. The tough, no-nonsense facade seemed to crack just a little. All right, he barked, though the usual sharp edge in his voice was noticeably blunted. He turned back to face his crew, his expression a mixture of exasperation and a reluctant, almost sheepish concession. Stop gawking like a bunch of schoolgirls. We can't just leave it down there to die, can we? Be bad for morale or something. He grumbled the last part under his breath, as if trying to find a practical justification for an act of pure compassion. Wastes good daylight, though, this whole circus. A visible wave of relief washed over Marco's face. Sully even cracked a small, surprised smile. The other crew members, who had been tensed with uncertainty, visibly relaxed, a few exchanging surprised glances. Tony, now committed, however reluctantly, shifted into problem-solving mode. Okay, new plan. Marco, you're the animal expert now, apparently. Find me some sturdy rope, something that won't snap. Sully, scout around, see if there's a bucket or something similar that'll fit down that shaft without getting wedged. And make it quick, we're burning daylight, people. Despite his gruff admonishments, there was a new energy in his voice, a reluctant determination that was infectious. The crew, sensing the unexpected shift in their foreman, sprang into action with a renewed sense of purpose, a silent acknowledgement that today their job description had unexpectedly expounded beyond demolition and construction to include wildlife rescue. The schedule might be taking a hit, but for a little while, something else had become more important. The impromptu rescue mission began with a burst of somewhat clumsy enthusiasm. Marco quickly located a coil of thick nylon rope, while Sully reappeared with a sturdy 5-gallon plastic bucket, its handle reinforced with duct tape. The other crew members gathered around the well, offering a mix of advice, encouragement, and the occasional well-meaning but unhelpful suggestion. Big Tony, surprisingly, took charge with a focused, if still somewhat gruff, patience. Okay, tie that rope good and tight to the handle, Chuck. Double knot it. We don't want the bucket taking a dive without a return ticket. Their first attempts were far from smooth. The well was deeper than it looked, and the opening was just wide enough for the bucket to pass through, but narrow enough to make maneuvering it difficult. The juvenile fox, understandably terrified by the sudden appearance of a large plastic object descending from above, retreated further into the darkest corner of the well, its small body pressed against the damp stone. It let out a series of sharp, frightened yelps. "Easy, easy," Tony cautioned as they lowered the bucket too quickly on the first try, causing it to bang against the side of the well. "You'll scare the stripes off it, slow and steady." They tried baiting the bucket with a piece of a leftover ham sandwich from someone's lunch. The fox, however, was far too scared to be tempted by food, its primal fear overriding any hunger pangs. Each time the bucket neared the bottom, the fox would scramble to the opposite side, its claws making frantic, useless scratching sounds on the smooth walls. Frustration began to set in. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the dusty construction site. Sweat trickled down their faces. The initial excitement of the rescue attempt was giving way to the sober realization that this was going to be much harder than they'd anticipated. Yet, a new dynamic had emerged. The usual worksite banter, the occasional grumbling about the heat or the workload was replaced by a quiet, focused cooperation. Men who usually competed for overtime or argued over the best tools were now working together, holding ropes, peering into the darkness, offering suggestions, united by the shared, unspoken goal of saving the small, terrified creature trapped below. After several more fruitless attempts, with the fox growing increasingly agitated and the crew's frustration mounting, Marco had an idea. He'd noticed how the fox shied away from the hard plastic of the bucket, how it seemed parched and wary of everything. "Boss," he said, hesitantly approaching Tony, maybe the bucket itself is scaring it. It's just hard plastic, and it looks really thirsty down there." Tony, who had been about to call for another, more forceful attempt, paused. He looked at Marco, then down into the well, where the fox was now huddled, panting in a far corner. He grunted, a sound that could mean anything, but he didn't dismiss the suggestion. "What'd you have in mind then, smart guy?" Tony asked, though his tone was less challenging than usual. "Well," Marco continued, gaining a little confidence, "what if we line the bucket with something soft, like an old jacket maybe? Make it seem less like a trap. And maybe put a bottle of water in there, with the cap off. It might be desperate enough for a drink." Tony considered it for a moment, rubbing his stubbled chin. It sounded a bit soft-headed for a construction site, but their current methods clearly weren't working. "All right," he conceded. "Can't hurt to try, I suppose. Chuck, you got that ratty old sweatshirt in your truck? Go get it, and someone find a water bottle." A few minutes later, the bucket was transformed. Chuck's faded, oil-stained sweatshirt was carefully arranged inside, creating a softer, more inviting lining. A half-full plastic water bottle, its cap removed, was nestled securely within. This time, they lowered the modified bucket with extreme care, almost inch by inch. Marco leaned over the well, speaking in a low, calm, soothing voice, words that perhaps the fox didn't understand, but whose tone might convey reassurance. "Easy now, fella. It's okay. Just some water for you." The bucket settled gently on the well floor. The fox, which had been pressed tightly against the far wall, slowly uncurled. It eyed the strange new object with intense suspicion, its nose twitching. It took a hesitant step, then another. The crew above held their breath, a silent, collective plea hanging in the dusty air. The fox crept closer, its gaze fixed on the water bottle. It sniffed at the edge of the bucket, then at the sweatshirt. It hesitated for what felt like an eternity, its small body tensed. Then, with a movement so quick it almost surprised them, the fox tentatively, cautiously, stepped one paw into the bucket, then another. It dipped its head towards the water bottle, took a few quick, lapping drinks, then, as if making a final, desperate decision, it settled down fully into the soft lining. A collective, barely audible sigh of relief went through the crew. "Got him," Marco whispered, his voice filled with exultation. "Haul him up," Tony commanded, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "Slow and steady, boys. Don't spook 'em now." With a coordinated effort, The crew began to slowly, carefully hoist the rope. The bucket, now carrying its precious, wild cargo, ascended smoothly from the gloomy depths of the well. Every man around the wellhead was silent, their attention riveted on the emerging bucket, their movements precise and gentle. They were acutely aware of the frightened animal within and the precariousness of this final stage. As the bucket cleared the stone lip of the well and was swung gently onto the dusty ground, the juvenile fox blinked in the sudden bright daylight. It looked small, disoriented, and utterly out of place amidst the burly construction workers and the detritus of their trade. For a heart-stopping second, it remained frozen inside the sweatshirt-lined haven, its wide amber eyes darting around at the circle of large watching men. Then, instinct took over. With a sudden, explosive burst of energy, the fox scrambled out of the bucket. It landed lightly on its paws, shook its dusty russet fur once, and then, without a moment's hesitation, it bolted. It was a streak of reddish-brown against the dull earth, its bushy, white-tipped tail held high. It didn't pause, didn't look back. It ran with the desperate, untamed speed of a creature tasting freedom after confinement, heading straight for the overgrown fields and tangled tree line that bordered the far edge of the construction site. In seconds, it had vanished into the tall grass, swallowed by the wildness from which it had come. A collective cheer, rough but heartfelt, went up from the crew. They watched the spot where the fox had disappeared, grins spreading across their dusty faces. The tension that had gripped them during the delicate rescue operation dissolved into a wave of shared triumph. The well-dweller, a fleeting interruption to their workday, was free. The crew stood there for a moment longer, a loose circle around the now empty well, the sounds of their cheering slowly fading into satisfied chuckles and murmurs. Sully let out a whoop and clapped Marco on the back. "Nice one, kid. Guess you ain't just good for hauling lumber." Chuck retrieved his oil-stained sweatshirt from the bucket, shaking it out with a grin. The dusty, noisy construction site, usually a place of relentless labor, felt momentarily lighter, imbued with a sense of shared accomplishment that had nothing to do with concrete or steel. Big Tony cleared his throat, a gruff sound that drew their attention. He kicked at a loose stone near the well, his expression carefully neutral, almost as if he were trying to feign indifference to the collective elation. All right, settle down," he grumbled, though the usual bite was missing from his tone. "Enough lollygagging around like we just won the lottery. Back to work. We lost enough time on that varmint." He turned, intending to head back to the blueprints and the pressing demands of the schedule. But as he did, Marco and a couple of the other men who were closest caught a fleeting, almost unbelievable sight. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of Big Tony's lips, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated satisfaction that he couldn't quite suppress. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stern foreman's mask, but it had been there. The men exchanged knowing glances. Their tough-as-nails boss, the man who lived and breathed schedules and bottom lines, had a softer side after all. The rescue of the well-dweller hadn't just been about saving an animal. It had, in its own small way, revealed something unexpected about the man who led them. And that, perhaps, was as much of a victory as the fox's freedom. Later that afternoon, the familiar symphony of construction had fully resumed. Saws whined, hammers rang out, and the excavator once again roared as it bit into the earth. On the surface, it was business as usual at the old Henderson farmstead. Yet, something had subtly shifted. The camaraderie amongst the crew, always present to some degree in the shared toil of their profession, felt a little warmer, a little easier. An inside joke about Marco the Fox Whisperer made the rounds, punctuated by good-natured laughter. When Sully needed a hand lifting a heavy beam, two men jumped to help without even being asked. Even Big Tony seemed different, though he'd likely deny it if anyone dared to mention it. His booming orders were still booming, but perhaps with a fraction less harshness, a shade more patience when explaining a tricky measurement. He even caught himself almost smiling when he overheard Chuck teasing Marco about his newfound animal rescue skills. Marco, as he worked, found his gaze drifting occasionally towards the old well. It was now properly and securely covered with heavy planks, a temporary measure until it could be permanently filled. But it was no longer just a hole in the ground, an obstacle to be removed. It was a place where something unexpected, something good had happened. A place where a gruff foreman and a dusty crew had paused their relentless work to extend a moment of compassion to a creature in distress. The warmth of that shared experience lingered in the dusty air, a quiet understanding that had little to do with blueprints or building codes. It was a reminder that even in the toughest, most pragmatic environments, amidst the noise and the grime, a space for kindness could be found, revealing a shared humanity that often lay hidden beneath calloused hands and gruff exteriors. The well dweller was gone, but the subtle shift it had caused in the men who rescued it remained, a quiet echo of a job well done, of a different, more resonant kind.